I'm Caleb Bissinger, and this is The Next Big Idea. Artificial intelligence is coming for your job, your creativity, and your relevance. At least that's what some YouTube videos and Reddit threads will tell you. There's no use resisting, they say. AI is going to overtake us next Wednesday, at the latest. But my guest today doesn't see it that way. Angus Fletcher is a neuroscientist turned English professor, and in his new book, Primal Intelligence, he argues that we have powers, intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense that AI is mechanically incapable of replicating. Computers think in probability, we think in stories. And when the data gets thin, when the terrain is unfamiliar, that's when we shine. We can improvise, adapt, invent entirely new approaches. The problem, Angus says, is we've lost touch with this primal intelligence. Over the next hour, he's going to show us how to get it back. It all begins with a call from the U.S. Army.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Angus Fletcher, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
I'm thrilled to be here.
You are, by your own admission, an uncoordinated, nearsighted klutz. You're an English professor. You're a Shakespeare enthusiast. I imagine there's at least one tweed jacket somewhere in your closet. And yet your new book, Primal Intelligence, opens with you at a U.S. Army Special Operations training site. What on earth were you doing there?
Yeah, well, obviously I was so nearsighted that I didn't realize where I was. No, the truth of the story is that I've been spending my entire career developing a different theory of the brain. And it's such a weird theory of the brain that they locked me up in English departments where they put all the truly crazy people on any college campus. And eventually I thought I was just going to sort of live here and die here like everyone's favorite English professors in my tweed jacket, teaching classes on Shakespeare to undergraduates who are getting all the answers off of ChatGPT. But one day, get a knock on my door, and it turns out it's someone from the Army who actually looks eerily like me because the Army has developed this program where they want to try and make you feel always at ease, so you're not being spied on. But of course, nothing actually makes you feel more comfortable than somebody who looks exactly like you. And that was my first encounter with the U.S. Army. And then they brought me in to
Wait, hold on. I may have missed that detail in the book.
I didn't put that in the book.
The person they sent, they specifically chose that person because they resembled you?
To be honest with you, I don't actually 100% know the logic, except that when people see us together, they think that we're twins. And so it slowly began to dawn on me that perhaps the reason that I had immediately trusted this person was because the Army had totally hacked my psyche and essentially, just created my slightly more agile self and sent them to intercept me.
Anyway, so as you were saying, okay, so the Army has sought you out.
The Army saw me out, and they basically are like, look, you have this totally different theory of the brain. And, to give you a couple of the highlights of my theory of the brain is I think that our brain works very differently from a computer. A computer uses lots and lots of data to identify patterns and things like that. And, the human brain gets very overwhelmed very quickly with data. We don't like data. Instead, what we like to do is we like to initiate action. That's why we get restless. That's why we get anxious. The entire purpose of our brain is to come up with new behaviors because new behaviors are what allow you to win in the endless fight for life. And so I have this totally different theory of the brain. It revolves around the fact that instead of thinking in data, we think in story, technically narrative cognition, all this kind of stuff. And the Army comes up to me and they say, look, Angus, you might not know this about us, but we actually invented computers in World War II. We basically invented generative AI. We've invented all this stuff. And we've come to the conclusion that you're right about a lot of it. It's actually not really that great. It doesn't work that well. And we would like to give you the opportunity to test your research. Because the thing we've noticed about you is you've published all these theoretical papers, but you've really done very little applied research. Would you like to come and see if your theories work if we give you access to our classified team? So, of course, like any professor who spent his entire life with his crazy theories, I jumped at the opportunity for the U.S. government to essentially give me access to unlimited funds to test them and see if they were correct.
So you've been alluding to this alternative theory of the brain that you have, which is about sort of narrative cognition, as you've said, this way that we think in stories. And this plugs into the crux of this book, which is this idea of primal intelligence, this idea that we've been defining intelligence incorrectly in the modern world, and that there's this other kind of innate, natural cleverness that we have. So just in simple terms here at the outset, because we're going to really dig into this concept throughout the rest of the conversation, but in simple terms, what is primal intelligence?
Primal intelligence is your ability to act smart with limited information.
And what makes this feel timely is that you say again and again and again in the book that this is something that humans can do and AI cannot. Why is it that AI can't react in the way that we can? Why is this ancient hardware that we have still so much better than this modern hardware of artificial intelligence?
Well, because we're just running totally different mechanisms. I mean, it'd be a little bit like if you said to me, Angus, why is it that your saw is so much better at sawing than my hammer? I keep using my hammer to try and cut pieces of wood in half. And what's happened in the modern world is we've developed this bizarre idea that intelligence is either reducible to computation, or if it's not reducible to computation, it must be magic. It must be consciousness. It must be some other ineffable power that is just sort of granted to us magically in some way. And the reality of the human brain, if you just look at the brain, it's far more mechanically complicated than a transistor. We could go into just endless detail about this, but the simple thing to say to yourself is essentially the human brain is a Swiss Army knife, and the computer brain is a calculator. What are the things you can do with a Swiss Army knife that you can't do with a calculator? And the answer is almost everything other than math. And so the mechanisms that underlie human intelligence evolved. They date back to the animal neuron, which is over 500 million years old. They evolved to act intelligently in uncertainty, because what's the key to acting intelligently in uncertainty? It's to improvise and initiate new actions and then rapidly learn through feedback which of those actions is working in the way that you want. What computers do is they learn by sitting passively and absorbing galactic amounts of information through a process known as induction, then finding patterns in that, and then using those patterns to establish predictive probabilities and all these kinds of things, which can be very useful in information-rich and stable environments. But the moment you get into a cloudy, murky, foggy environment, or an environment that's changing rapidly, and so that data is becoming fragile and breaking, computers just lose out every time to this animal neuron process.
Right, because it fundamentally what's happening under the hood of these large language models is they are just massive prediction engines, and the data gets thin. They break down. They're unable to see the next move because they don't have the right source material to figure that out, whereas our brains can adapt and improvise, as you say, and come up with novel solutions to unfamiliar terrain.
Yeah. And so, one way to think about this, which I talk about a little bit in the book, but not that much, so it might be fun to elaborate on if you want in the podcast, is that computers think in probability and humans think in possibility.
I love that.
And a lot of times if you ask someone in the modern world what a possibility is, they'll say, well, it's a low probability. So, a possibility might be like a 10% or a 2% or a 1% chance. It's actually totally different than a probability. A probability is calculated off things that have occurred before. And so what you're doing is you're correlating all these different events. And based on those correlations, you're saying, what's the likelihood based on these indicators that that event is going to repeat itself? So a probability is based on things that have happened before. A possibility is something that has never happened, but is possible because it doesn't violate the laws of your environment. So super simple example of this, late 19th century, the world's greatest mathematician, his name was Lord Kelvin. He was sort of, the human version, essentially, of AI. He was this giant computer. He had run all the numbers. Total genius. But he's mostly famous now for predicting very confidently that there would never be an airplane. And he said this in 1895, and then he repeated it in 1902, which was exactly 1 year before the Wright brothers made their famous flight. And so, of course, you're like, what is going on, Lord Kelvin? And he was correct in the sense that the probability of an airplane was zero. It was actually statistically zero. And he would go through all these kinds of charts and computations to demonstrate that it couldn't happen. However, the Wright brothers, they thought in possibility, and they thought in possibility actually because their father allowed them to stay home from school on days in which they agreed to read a novel from the bookshelf. So they would read Charles Dickens or some other Victorian novelist, and this would spark their imagination. And they were able to see, hey, we understand that airplanes have never happened before, but they are possible. They don't violate the laws of gravity. They don't violate the laws of lift and these kinds of things. And so that was what caused them to spend all this time tinkering and eventually invent the airplane. And that's, in general, how your brain works. Your brain is not thinking in terms of these huge probabilities. And that's why when your brain walks into a very, very stable, information-dense environment, it loses to computers. Because computers are able to take all that information, crunch it very rapidly, identify patterns, and be like, this is what's going to happen next. But the moment that you enter into a volatile environment, all of a sudden the computers immediately break because they don't have any data that allows them to understand what that means. That's just the difference between how we and computers think. And that's why computers are our friends. We like computers. Computers are good. They're very useful, but we've become over-reliant on them. And then we've also started to teach ourselves to think like them. And this is where it starts to get dangerous because we're no longer contributing.
Let's dig into primal intelligence. And it has 4 pillars: intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense. Let's start with intuition. You say in the book that most people, even the legendary Nobel Prize winning psychologist Danny Kahneman, misunderstand intuition. What do most people think it is, and what is it actually?
So Daniel Kahneman follows from a tradition of computer science that identifies intuition as pattern matching. And the idea is that when your brain sees a pattern reoccurring, it suddenly goes, aha, I see it again. And that's where intuitions come from. There's a bunch of reasons we know this is not the case. One of the reasons we know this is the case is because children have pretty high intuition and are worse at pattern matching than adults. But the example that I actually use in the book comes from U.S. Army Special Operations, because what they noticed is that the individuals who had the highest intuition were able to do the opposite of pattern match. What they were able to do was spot exceptions to rules. In other words, they were able to spot when something was not fitting a pattern. And this explains why computers are dreadful at intuition. A computer has never had a successful intuition about the future, right? A computer has never called you up and been like, I have this idea that, this might be possible that has never occurred before. Because again, computers are stuck in patterns and probabilities and so on and so forth. And so I became very interested in this idea of it's exceptions to rules that are powering human intelligence. And how do you get better at spotting those exceptions? And why is this something that the human brain is able to run? And so that's kind of what I talk about a bit in the chapter.
And so how do you get better at spotting exceptions?
The first rule that the military gives is surround yourself with exceptions. So the way that the brain evolves is to, as a child, think that everything is exceptional. That's why children spend so much time pausing and lingering on things. That's why if you take a child into a supermarket, you'll be there all year because like every new cereal box, they're like, that's amazing. And as an adult, what you do is you learn to start to filter and you start to think more like a computer because you're interested in efficiency. And you start to, when you see something that's an exception to one of your mental rules, typically you dismiss it as noise, or you regress it to the mean, or you say, you know what, that's weird. And so what you need to do is you need to get back in your childhood state of mind of seeing everything as exceptional. And what's the simplest way to do that? It's to travel. And this is something that a lot of us have lost the art of doing in the modern world. So a lot of people, when they travel, they go to a hotel, they visit all of the various tourist things that have been set up and designed for you. They probably spend, I would say, at least 40% of their time on their phone for some reason or another, scrolling and checking news back home and doing all these kinds of things. And so you're not actually immersing your brain in travel. What you really want to do is you want to go somewhere where you fully embrace that other culture and you turn off your technology. And then what that does is that starts to pop your brain with everything is exceptional. And then when you come back from that kind of travel, you see the world, your familiar world, with fresh eyes again. And I think most people have had this experience. You come back from travel and all of a sudden you're like, why does my business do that? Why is this happening? What's going on? And that's because you're spotting all these exceptions, and instead of dismissing them, you're leaning into them.
Yes, I love that. And I think we do have this tendency to travel in sort of hermetically sealed ways, right? Like there's this great line in a David Sedaris interview, I think, where someone asked him why he likes travel. And he's like
for me to get on a train and go to Switzerland, I don't think, oh, good, I get to have an adventure. I think, oh, great, I get to make an ass out of myself in 2 different languages.
It's immersing yourself in that discomfort where everything is anomalous and unfamiliar that actually provokes intuition.
Yeah. And, everything about travel is so inefficient. You can tell immediately if someone's going to be a good travel companion or not, if they get irritated the moment that something goes wrong. Like, does your travel companion roll with it? Or does your travel companion start to get stressed? And that stress is coming from our expectation in the modern world that somehow we can control our environment, because that's what computers want to do. Computers want tomorrow to be the same as yesterday, because that's math. And the more you're in that mathematical state of mind where it has to be the way that I planned it, that's you're thinking like a computer. When you travel and things start to go wrong and you're like, you know what, this is awesome. Because if I hadn't missed that bus, I wouldn't have had a chance to walk across the street and explore that cafe. And everyone knows this about travel. Everyone has this experience of travel, but everyone has also experienced the discomfort of getting into it, trying to convince yourself that, oh, I can relax, I can do this kind of thing. And the purpose of that travel experience is to remind you that that's really where your intelligence lies. Most of us don't have the opportunity to travel every other week and then come back to the job and then reacclimate, and all this kind of stuff. So what you really want to do is you want to start to identify that part of your brain that goes on when you travel and start to get faster and faster turning that on. And of course, there are plenty of times when you want to get faster and faster turning it off. For example, I work a lot with ER doctors. I did a lot of research with them for the book. And so the 2 things that you're constantly confronting as an ER doctor is, 1, a totally novel case. So you're doing a surgery that you've never had to do before, or, you're dealing with a gunshot that is irregular, or maybe you're operating on a patient and that patient has unusual anatomy in some way. So you've constantly be able to turn on that part of your brain, which is open to and leaning into exceptions and handling them. Otherwise, you're going to kill the patient. On the other hand, 95% of medicine still remains completely regular. You don't want to all of a sudden be approaching them like a 4-year-old or like you're a traveler from some foreign land. You're like, how is the anesthetic working? The patient would die from the amount of time it takes you to have a conversation with the anesthesiologist. And so as an ER doctor, you've got to constantly toggle back and forth between appreciating the radical novelty, like you're a traveler to an undiscovered country, and then switching that off and being like, yeah, I've seen this a million times before. I know exactly how to make this incision, or I know exactly when to call in this nurse to do this procedure, or do that other thing. And so that's the real key there, is not just to travel all the time, but when you travel, to identify the switch in your brain and learn how to turn it on and off quickly.
So this capacity for spotting exceptions, you also saw it firsthand when you were with these special operators and they made you submit to a lie detector test. Will you tell that story?
I get this phone call from U.S. Army Special Operations. They're like, we're really interested in your theories. We want to put you into our teams to test them. But first, we've got to test you to make sure that you personally are trustworthy. I had to go through this, what I was told was going to be a lie detector test. So I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have this lie detector test. And so I go into this room expecting to see some enormously complicated machine like you've all seen in the movies. You get hooked up with various forms of tape and electrodes and all the rest of it, and you sit there and there's like the needle going up and down.
You thought you were going to be Ben Stiller in Meet the Parents.
That's exactly what I thought. I literally thought that was what was happening. And instead I get in there and there's just 3 individuals sitting in chairs, literally sitting in folding chairs. And they're sitting there in boots and jeans and they've got their arms crossed. And that's the lie detector test, is I got to convince these 3 people that I'm not lying. And so I sit down and I'm expecting to get these really challenging questions, but I don't. I get, like, what's your name? What high school did you go to? And then after it's gone for a few minutes, one of the individuals interviewing me leans forward and he goes, your accent is fake. I don't know if anyone listening to this podcast caught that, but that's true. I am speaking with a fake American accent. And I've spoken with this fake American accent for a while. I've spoken to thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans. No one's ever called me on it, but he called me on it. And so I very quickly said to him, I said, that's true. I am speaking with a fake American accent, but you got to understand, I was born overseas. I was born in the United Kingdom. And, so I lost my accent when I came to the United States. And there was a long pause. And he goes, that can't be true. And I was alarmed. And he goes, that can't be true because I can tell that you lost your accent suddenly. And he would later explain to me that he was able to determine this because a lot of my vowel structures and the way that I use vowels is very weird and is not connected with any region of the United States and is instead sort of indicative of what I guess happens when people come over to this country and try and speak like Americans, which is they watch a lot of TV and force certain vowels. And so at this point, I then had to tell this very embarrassing story about myself, which I will disclose to your listeners, which is,
please.
Yes, it's true. I came over to this country and I had an English accent, and I ended up going to school and being bullied a lot for my accent. And, like any young person, I didn't like being bullied. And so I didn't lose my accent. I instead stood up for myself and continued to talk in this accent. And then what ended up happening was, bizarrely, because of this bullying, I preserved my accent all the way through my teenage years. And so I was still in high school, even though I'd come to this country when I was quite young. And I was still speaking with this English accent, as sort of a form of defiance.
Source of pride or something.
Yeah. And, one day I was just like, this is ridiculous. Because every time I meet someone on the street, the first thing they say is, oh, you're from England. And I'm like, sort of, not really. I'm actually from Philadelphia. I talk this accent, And then they're always like, when did you move here? And I would be like, like many years ago. And they'd be like, oh, that's so interesting. You still have this accent. And I was like, actually, it's kind of odd. So I just decided, after I graduated high school, that I would force myself to lose my accent so that I could go to college as my authentic self. This was this idea that I had. So I basically came up with a fake accent as a way of being my real self. And then I went to college. And then everyone at college just thought, hey, Angus is an American. I was sitting there in this interrogation and I realized I had to say this to the interrogators. But the moment I said this, they're like, we believe that. And I was like, wait, why'd you believe that? And they're like, because it's too weird to be made up. And this is this idea of spotting these exceptions. And what they said to me, which I think is true, is that, real life is almost always stranger than fiction. And real life is also consistent. So what happens is all those weird anomalies start to fit together into a consistent narrative that makes sense. That was the kind of breakthrough moment where they started to trust me. And I started to realize that they actually had a lot to teach me about how the human brain works.
Will your sense of self crumble if you give us a little taste of what your old accent sounded like?
No, I'd be very happy to talk like this if it interests you. So I don't know if you can tell the accent because it's been a while since I've used it and I generally don't use it that much. True story, however, when I was in college, when my parents would call me, I would still actually go back to the accent and sort of freak out the people around me in college briefly. And eventually I managed to get out of that habit. And now I just only talk with this, my real fake American accent.
We were talking before the show that I also grew up in Philadelphia. I went to a Quaker school, so my knowledge of the inner workings of the U.S. Army is next to none. I actually was not even familiar with this concept of an operator. Can you just tell us who these folks are? It's kind of an incredible role that they take on.
So just the big pictures, we've got the Green Berets, who are non-classified, unconventional warriors who are sort of almost like teacher warriors, kind of gurus who go out and spread democracy and are engaged in a lot of espionage, infiltration, and that kind of stuff. You've also got this direct action unit, which I'm technically not allowed to name, but is associated with a certain Chuck Norris movie, which everyone can look up.
America's elite anti-terrorist commandos. Their only mission, to neutralize the enemy. Starring Chuck Norris, the Delta Force.
This is a hijack! Heads down!
And then there's another unit, which is also highly classified, which also falls under Joint Special Operations Command, which was actually the unit that recruited me. And that unit is more of an intelligence unit. Basically, its job is to anticipate problems in the future and stop them before they happen. And so it's this entire unit that sort of exists in this sort of really, I think, kind of like marvelous space where you have all these highly intelligent people who are trying to say, what's going to happen next year, 2 years from now, 5 years from now? What problems could occur? They reached out to me because as they were looking at my research, they started to realize, hey, everything this guy is saying is tracking what we're seeing about artificial intelligence. And this will kind of like tie everything together. So basically, let's go back to World War II. What is the first thing the U.S. Army does? Is it designs ENIAC, which is the world's first electronic general purpose computer. It's basically the modern computer. So the Army invents the computer. And the Army initially has this idea, hey, if we just kind of like feed all this data into this computer, it'll just predict the future and we'll know everything, But then in another branch of the Army, which is the Army Air Force, they noticed a problem. And the problem came about because they saw that certain pilots were more effective than other pilots. And when they went to investigate, their initial hypothesis was, of course, this being the Army, that the good pilots were following the rules better, that they were doing what they had been taught in school. But it turned out, no, the better pilots were more creative because by being more creative, they were more unpredictable. And they were able to initiate flight moves that the enemy wasn't expecting. And so the Army's like, okay, we've got to solve this problem of creativity. How do we solve the problem of creativity? Because clearly data alone isn't enough. And so they put someone whose name is J.P. Guilford. He was at the time, I think, a lieutenant colonel and then got later promoted to be a colonel. He was a professor prior to that at the University of Southern California. They put him on the task. And at the time, he was very influenced by ENIAC and computation. And he thought to himself, look, clearly the human brain is some form of computer. Therefore, creativity must itself be computational. I'm going to reduce creativity to computational protocols, and that'll solve the problem. And he did that. He was successful. He reduced them to two protocols that have since become famous. They're now known as divergent thinking and convergent thinking. If you haven't heard of those terms before, you've probably heard of brainstorming. Brainstorming is divergent thinking. It's randomly associating ideas. And what you do at the end of a brainstorming session is you write all the ideas on the board, and then you cross out the ones that seem harder to do or less likely. So you're essentially putting a probability map over them. So that's convergent thinking. And together, those make up something known as ideation, which is the basis of design thinking and is also how generative AI works. So essentially, in World War II, the U.S. Army invented generative AI. Now, the technology obviously wasn't good enough to operationalize it, but the two things started to converge. And so you can go back 10 years ago or so, the Army's already running sort of basic versions of what we now think of as ChatGPT and Claude and all these kinds of things. So it's running all this kind of stuff. And in the Army's mind, this is going to solve all the problems because we've got all the data, right? We've got the computer that can predict everything that's knowable, but we've also got the creative thing that can create all the options that haven't been created yet. And the Army discovered, first of all, the creative thing wasn't actually very creative. It wasn't actually coming up with all sorts of innovative and exciting, groundbreaking new things, no matter how much power they pumped into it. And also they discovered that the more time that humans spent with these machines, the worse that humans got. And the more that humans were trained in divergent thinking and ideation and brainstorming, the less creative that they got, the less able they were to respond to new and unpredicted circumstances. And this became a concern on the front edge with these operators, because the whole thing about being an operator is you're given a plan, then you're thrown out of a helicopter into chaos. The plan breaks, and you've got to very rapidly come up with a new plan. You got to bootstrap it. The Army said to me, look, we're just interested in just having you explain to us on a basic level how it is that our operators who are good at these things, who are creative, who are able to come up with new plans, what are they doing? Just tell us what's going on in their brain based on your theory. And then secondly, if you possibly could, help us teach those operators to teach our young recruits how to do that. Because what we're seeing is less and less people are coming out of school with that ability. And so we've been able to select for operators who have that skill, apparently naturally, but we're getting less and less of them out of the school system. And we are needing more and more operators because the global war on terror is demanding that we expand. And so we have this real supply problem. And so that's what I was put in to basically help fix. And I do not want to pretend that somehow I alone fixed this problem, but I do want to say that the problem was fixed based on the methods in the book. And what the methods in the book talk about is helping people think the opposite of computers, think the opposite of generative AI. What you do is you start by spotting an exception. When you spot that exception, what do you do with it? Well, you double down on it. Why'd you double down on it? Well, because this is how a story works. What's a story? A story starts with a hero. A hero is an exception to the rules of their environment. What does the hero do? Does the hero compromise with their environment? Does the hero give up? No, the hero doubles down on what's unique about them and changes their environment. And so these are all these natural narrative story processes. So we've started to move from intuition here, which is spotting the exception, into imagination, which is that next step, turning the opportunity, turning that exception into a plan. And what we started to show was that you could train up these processes to get faster and faster and faster in young recruits. So when they were released in volatile environments, they got faster at spotting exceptions, they got faster at doubling down on them, turning them into new plans, faster on testing those new plans, and faster at responding when those new plans didn't work to come up with other plans.
We'll be right back with more from Angus Fletcher, but first, a few ads to keep the lights on.
At Talus, we know cybersecurity can be tough and you can't protect everything, but with Talus, you can secure what matters most. With Talus industry-leading platforms, you can protect critical applications, data, and identities, anywhere and at scale with the highest ROI. That's why the most trusted brands and largest banks, retailers, and healthcare companies in the world rely on Talus to protect what matters most: applications, data, and identities. That's Talus, T-H-A-L-E-S. Learn more at talusgroup.com/cyber.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to help you make the most of your summer with Michelob Ultra, a superior light beer worth playing for. Play for it with the guys when you're competing to see who can sink more birdies on the golf course, because winning tastes even better with Ultra on the line. Play for Ultra. Fill your fridge with Michelob Ultra this summer. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2025 Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs, but luckily there's a simple answer to them: Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Welcome back to the show. The thesis of Angus Fletcher's new book, Primal Intelligence, is that our brains think in story. But what does that mean exactly? What is a story? Isn't it just a tool for communication?
So I do not think that story is for communication. Let me just start with that, because I just want to get that completely out of the way. And that's one of the reasons why people for a long time thought that I was nuts, because they're like, well, obviously, Angus, the purpose of stories is to communicate. And we all know that the way things work is we get the data, and then we analyze the data. And then we figure out what the data is telling us. And then we try and explain that to stupid people, but they don't understand. And so then we make a story about the data, and then they understand. So story is clearly about communicating what our rational brain has determined through computational purposes. That's the function of story. And I think the opposite. I think actually story is actually driving 95% of human intelligence. And that kind of data process is not driving any of it. And so, first of all, why do I think that? And then what is story? Well, the reason I think that is because how do we communicate with stories? We communicate with stories through language. And language is actually quite evolutionarily novel. Maybe it's 100,000 years old. It might be 1,000,000 years old, but it's quite new. So it's really weird to think that a brain that evolved to think computationally hundreds of millions of years ago is suddenly better at understanding language stories when these are at most 1,000,000 years old. That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so the alternative is, no, the reason that stories make sense is because the human brain thinks in stories. That's why they're so effective. And then when you start to think about your own life, you're like, oh, actually, I do think about a lot of my life in stories. I think about, where did I come from? Where am I going? What are my plans for the day? These are all narrative processes. And when you start to think about, well, why is it that I think it's story? Well, another name for story is a plot. Another name for a plot is a plan.
Yeah.
What is the purpose of human intelligence ultimately? It's to make plans, because a plan is the ability to use action to move your body in some way that allows you to get what you want. And the power of the human brain is not just to make plans, but to make new plans, because life is constantly changing. And so if you're able to make new plans that work, you're able to survive and beat out your adversaries. And so that means the ability to come up with new plans that work is the key to intelligence. And so if you translate that onto stories, the ability to come up with new stories that work is the key to intelligence.
And you say that a good plan and a good story has an optimal shape. What does that look like?
When we're talking about story in the brain, every brain has its own story of itself. Your brain is running this story about itself. And that story about itself is, where did I come from? Where am I going? How am I going to get there? So that's all together. And so we started to say, okay, well, why is it that some people are more effective at living their life story? And in other words, what life stories seem like they're most effective? And so we started to do this by studying the operators and to starting to see which of them was most effective in these chaotic environments at being able to succeed at whatever it is they wanted to do. And what we discovered is that the individuals who were successful, first of all, they all had different life stories, right? Because all of us are different. But the thing that they had in common was that their pasts, their previous history, was integrated and their future was branching. And so their individual life narrative looked a little bit like you might think of a trident or something like that. It had that kind of, long integrated shaft, and then it had these kind of forking, branching trees coming out of it. And the reason that that's so effective is that your sense of momentum and direction comes from your past. This is why the more you reflect on your past, the more you develop a sense of who you are and where it is you're going. It's the same thing in nature with a stream. It gets all of its momentum from the water behind it as it runs down. But in the near term, right in front of you, you need to be flexible because you might encounter some unexpected obstacle. And so the key is that you have that branching future, which allows you to flex around whatever in front of you, but that long momentum from your past that ensures that even if you flex, you're still going to be continuing in the same basic direction that you were going before. And it's that combination of having past integrity and future flexibility that allows operators to get to the target through a path that other people hadn't expected or anticipated.
You talked to, I think, one operator who says a good plan has two features: a single long-term goal, but many possible paths. Or as I like to say, you can target only one mountaintop, but you can take different routes up.
That's exactly right. And the reason this is important is because even though it makes sense to say that we should all have a single long-term goal and be flexible in how we get there, almost everybody in the world is the opposite of this. I mean, we're always trying to do the same thing over and over and over again. We're constantly trying to, apply our tactics, like whatever our limited skill set is, to all these different situations. And we also have like 45 different big things that we want to do with our life. And the key is to start to narrow your sense of where you're going on a single big target that is deeply fulfilling to you by studying your past and realizing what works for you, and then developing all of these short-term abilities to be flexible by multiplying your tactical toolbox. And so I talk about that a lot in the chapter, but the best way to do that in terms of story is to read a lot of stories that are different. And not to do what most people do, which is kind of get in this groove where they're watching stories that agree with them. Go watch stories that you don't understand. Go read memoirs about people who made choices that were different from you. Those are all helping you develop your imaginative range and your imaginative flexibility, and that's helping you survive more effectively in the future.
So we've talked about imagination. Let's talk about the third pillar of primal intelligence, which is emotion. And emotions, I think a lot of us can think they're just sort of pesky and annoying, but you see them actually as really sophisticated data almost, right? That this is the flight instruments telling us how our plan is going. Am I getting that right?
You're 100% correct. I mean, you're doing a much better job at articulating this book than I am, which I really appreciate as the author. So emotions are the smartest thing in your brain. And we know they're the smartest thing in your brain because they're the oldest part of your brain, and they remain the most powerful part of your brain. So they've kept you alive for a very, very long time, and they're keeping you alive now. So we know that they're really smart. And so the question is why do people think that they're dumb nowadays? And the answer is because we misunderstand emotions. Most people who value emotion believe in things like EQ and whatnot, or they'll talk about empathy in this almost quasi-mystical sense. And these understandings of emotion are all about somehow how my brain understands other brains, or somehow my brain understands the situation, and I'm able to see the world. Now, it's possible that you're a wizard, in which case you have that power. And I can't speak about that because I don't know anything about magic. But I do know from a scientific perspective that what your emotions evolved to understand is not other people's brains. or the world, they evolved to understand your own brain. And they are incredibly powerful signals at telling you what's going on in your own brain and serving as warnings and alerts to you to say, hey, you're in danger of getting yourself in this situation or that situation. Now is a chance for you to act to avoid that end. And so if we start really simply, the most powerful emotion in the brain comes to us from our amygdala, our fight or flight response, our threat response. So the moment you start feeling stressed, that's your brain telling you that you feel like you're in danger somehow. And the two most powerful features of that are fear and anger. And so you either start to get scared or you start to get aggressive. And so what's going on there and why do we have those emotions? Well, fear evolved in the human brain to alert you that you do not have a plan that you have confidence in. And so, as I was saying before, the purpose of intelligence is to have a plan. The purpose of your emotions is to monitor the state of your plans. When you're scared, that's your brain saying, you don't have a plan. And why would fear be the emotion? You know, for example, if you don't have a plan, why don't you just feel intense curiosity? That would seem to be a great emotion to feel, like when you don't have a plan. I'm going to be so curious right now. I should explore my world and discover a plan. Well, the reason is that fear makes you susceptible to influence. And what that means is that you take a plan from the person next to you who's suggesting that you do what you do. And so you notice this, the more scared you are, the better other people's suggestions seem, the more likely you are to pull in consultants. If you're graduating college, all of a sudden your parents seem very sensible with their suggestions about, you know, what to do with the rest of your life and so on and so forth. And that's because your brain, because it needs a plan, says, well, look, since I don't have a plan, I'm going to get scared and take that plan from somebody else. I'm going to become susceptible to influence. So if you start feeling scared, what that's your brain telling you is you're about to take on somebody else's plan. You're about to give up your own autonomy and do what somebody else suggests. In most cases in life, that's not a good place to be. And so your brain is warning you, start to take the initiative, start to take a first step plan, as we call it. What's the simplest thing you can do right now to start to regain your own sense of autonomy, momentum? So instead of being dependent on other people, instead of asking other people, what should I do? Instead of going to the internet or AI and saying, how do I deal with this situation? You come up with something on your own.
And then what about anger? So if fear is your brain saying, dude, you do not have a plan, what's anger?
Anger is your brain saying you've got exactly one plan.
So you better frickin' do it.
Yeah. And so the question is, why do you feel anger when you've only got one plan, right? I mean, there's lots of other emotions your brain could have evolved to signal this. And the reason that your brain feels anger is because your brain has learned over time that plans, when acted assertively, are more likely to work. And you see this all the time in your life. You see this, you know, I mean, someone comes to the room and just declares something. You're like, oh, this person must know what they're talking about. You know, that's your immediate response, you know. And so when your brain only has one plan, what it says to itself is, well, this is my only shot. I better make it count. So I'm going to be assertive, aggressive. I'm going to get angry. I'm going to try and impose my will. So again, there's intelligence there. If it turns out that you are in a life or death situation, maybe anger is the right thing to do. But in 99.9% of the time in the modern world, anger should instead be a signal for you to say, wait a second, is there another way? And you'll find this in your brain. The moment you discover another plan, your anger will recede immediately. And a lot of times in our society, the anger comes from interpersonal conflict. And the other way is to figure out a different way to communicate or to listen to the other person or to do something in some other way to kind of start to navigate this sense that you have that I've either got to dominate this person or everything is over, right? And so just realizing that your anger is signaling to you, is there really only one way to do this? If so, great. But otherwise, you're in danger of maybe causing harm to other people, burning other people out, and also maybe damaging your own credibility. Because if you get angry, people are going to remember that. And if you get angry and your plan doesn't work, you're in trouble.
Fourth and final pillar, common sense. And this, I think, is another one of those words that I think is misused or used in many different ways. You say common sense is knowing what you don't know. It reveals when your environment is fundamentally shifted in validating your old plans. How is common sense helpful in this primal intelligence framework?
So before I define common sense, let me just put it in the framework and then I'll explain it a little bit. I mean, so basically what we've been talking about in this framework is how do you come up with new plans? How do you figure out which plans are right for you? That's what emotion does. And then the final thing is which plans are going to work? Because once you come up with your plans for yourself, you want to know which plans are going to work. And the plans that are going to work are going to be the plans that match your environment. And so common sense evolved in the human brain as a way of diagnosing your environment and figuring out your environment. And to your point, yes, common sense is commonly misunderstood. So a lot of times people will act as though, well, common sense is just basically some form of pattern, some form of social pattern. Like this idea has been used over and over and over and over again. It's the kind of the high probability
folk
thing.
wisdom.
Right, exactly, yeah. And the answer is yes, that is common sense when today is the same as yesterday. However, common sense is also recognizing when today is different. And if you identify people who have high common sense, they're able to do what worked yesterday, today, when today is the same, but then abandon that immediately when things have changed and they try a new plan. And so really what common sense is your brain's ability to identify environmental volatility. It's your brain's ability to say, how many unknown unknowns are there? Because if there are very few unknown unknowns, I'm going to do what everybody else around me is doing, right? Because nothing's really changed. On the other hand, if we're entering an incredibly volatile environment, if there's a lot of unknown unknowns, then I've got to break with the pack. I've got to do something radically new, radically different. Because one thing I know about new environments is that old plans aren't going to work. That doesn't mean that whatever new plan I try is going to work immediately, but it means that that new plan has a higher chance of success than any old plan, no matter how successful that old plan was yesterday. If that was the best old plan yesterday, it's still less likely to work than a completely untested new plan today in this new environment. And so you've got to start to shift in these new environments into this idea of rapidly trying new things. And the more your environment is becoming volatile, you've got to start taking bigger and bigger chances with what you do.
Which is the exact opposite of what most of us do, right? Most of us take big risks when we feel safe and comfortable because we feel like if we fail, it'll be okay. And when things are volatile, unpredictable, scary, that's when we sort of are very risk averse and want to take the safest course we can think of. And you're suggesting, no, the commonsensical thing is to do the exact opposite of what we normally do.
That's exactly right. And thank you for expressing my position more eloquently than I could have. That's exactly right. I mean, so, if you talk to almost anybody, when their life is going well, they get bored. And then they start doing zany things, they're like, oh, I'm going to, this is a great opportunity for me to just launch some random business or make some big lifestyle shift or something like that. And then the moment that people's life starts getting scary, they're like, oh, I better do what everybody else is doing. Or I better go back to what kind of worked in the past. And so in the book, I talk about, for example, astronauts and how astronauts have this amazing ability when they're flying the rocket ship and everything is normal to act like a robot. And they'll literally just fly like a robot. They'll do the most boring possible thing because the environment is totally stable. But then, when you're in space, when you're engaging in any of these kinds of systems, all of a sudden something wildly volatile can come out of nowhere. And then all of a sudden, what do the astronauts do? They completely change. They come up with a totally new flight plan. They break all the rules. They blow the minds of everyone down in mission command. They literally not only do things that they haven't been told to do, but that often break a lot of the standard operating procedures before, and they save the spaceship. And then the moment they save the spaceship and everything calms down, they go back to being incredibly boring robots. And those are people who have high common sense. The people who act like robots in really boring, predictable times, and then act like the kind of most wild, unfettered artists you can imagine when things start to get unpredictable.
When we're experiencing these moments where environment is in flux, I think that's when our anxiety spikes, right? Because all of a sudden it becomes very hard to know, wait, do I stick with this plan? Do I take a different plan? What if I do this plan and then that happens and then that happens? Do I go in this direction or what's going to happen? And we start spiraling. And you write a lot in this chapter of the book about tuning your anxiety, about how to sort of use common sense to manage your anxiety when it starts ticking up as you're evaluating your plans in the midst of these unknown unknowns. Could you talk a little bit about tuning your anxiety, how that works?
Your anxiety evolved in your brain, like that spidey sense, to tell you something's a little bit different now. Something's a little bit odd. Something's a little bit off. And in the modern world, we don't understand that because we've been conditioned relentlessly to think that anxiety is bad. So we're conditioned to think that when we're anxious, that must be the sign of a mistake, and we need to sort of meditate or engage in mindfulness or something to eliminate the anxiety. The reality is that there is productive anxiety and unproductive anxiety. And what you want to do when you tune your anxiety is boost the levels of the productive anxiety and decrease the levels of unproductive anxiety. And so what I talk about in the chapter is the two most common kinds of unproductive anxiety. The first is when you're experiencing flashbacks from your past. So actually what you're anxious about is that something that happened 2 days ago is going to happen again now. And the reason that that's unproductive is because if you really think that something that happened 2 days ago is going to happen now. Make a plan to deal with that if it happens, and then forget about it because you've got the plan, right? So the reason your brain picked up on that is it was saying to you, you were unprepared for it then. Prepare for it, get prepared. And then once you've made a plan, you've made the best plan you can, don't sweat it anymore because you've got the plan. So that's the first kind of unproductive anxiety is you're actually having flashbacks to problems that you could have fixed already, and go ahead and fix them. The second kind of unproductive anxiety comes when you start looking too far into the future. And the reason for this is that the future is the definition of an unknown unknown. So the further you look into the future, the more anxious it will automatically make you because you'll start thinking about like, oh my goodness, I've got all these things to do and there's all these things that are unknown, and you start to feel your heart pressure rising. If you and I start to think about all the things we've got to do after this podcast and so on and so forth, we would start getting anxious in the middle of the podcast and we wouldn't be able to focus. And so what operators do is they say, instead of focusing unlimited on the future, right? That's a bad idea. And also, you can't focus literally just on the present, because if you just focus on the present like you do in mindfulness, you're not engaging with the near-term future, which is where you're orientated. Focus on what is the now plus one. So that step that's just ahead of the now that you can control and that you can influence. And when you start to do that, what you will find is that you'll get very quickly into flow. You enter flow states because you've cleared your mind of the past anxieties and you're now focused on the immediate task that's just a step ahead. So all these other anxieties about the future go away. And instead you have just a heightened sense of vigilance and focus that's really concentrated on what you're doing now.
Yeah, I was thinking as I read that section of this great E.L. Doctorow quote, the novelist, and he said, "Writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way." And that to me is now plus one. You can only see as far as your headlights, but that's one decision at a time, and you can make the whole trip that way.
That's exactly brilliant. And just imagine if you were driving in that fog, you start freaking out about what was,
right, what's 10 miles up the road.
You won't be focused on what's immediately in front of you. Yeah, no, exactly. And you got to learn that when life, and different situations, right? Sometimes life isn't that foggy. Sometimes you can look 2 days ahead. Sometimes you can look a year ahead, right? Because you're being given that opportunity and your anxiety isn't spiking because you're realizing,
Yes.
oh, okay, I have a clear window here and there's not a lot of volatility in between me and that event, But the moment that you start to feel your anxiety is interrupting your decision-making process, it's probably a sign that you're either living in the past or you're looking too far ahead.
Let's keep translating theory into practice. And let's talk about innovation. Let's talk about how we can combine these 4 pillars of primal intelligence we've been talking about to be more creative, more innovative. And, I think something we hear a lot is that innovation is recombination, right? That new ideas we're just remixing old ideas. And this is actually something that AI turns out to be pretty good at. But you say, bullshit. That's not what real innovation is. That's not what real creativity is. And that primal intelligence actually unlocks something truer and more powerful than remix. What is it?
Yeah, so that idea of remix, that is divergent thinking, convergent thinking. That's all part of this whole system of thought that goes back to J.P. Guilford and that computers can do. That's not how creatives think. What creatives do, as we've been talking about, is they take an exception and they double down on it. They say, where would it go? So a kind of classic example that I talk about in that chapter is Einstein. Einstein looks at light and, light does this weird thing where it's always the same speed wherever it is in the universe, which is another way of saying that it obeys local time. And so up to this point in the history of physics, everybody had been like, light is the exception to the rule. That time is universal, but for some reason, weirdly, light itself only obeys local time. And then Einstein said, well, let's just double down on that exception. Let's say it's not just light that obeys local time. Let's say everything obeys local time. What is that? That's relativity. And that's modern physics. That's actually where innovation comes from. It comes from spotting the exception and making the new rule. It comes from saying, hey, this weird thing is actually showing me a whole new possibility for the future. Let me chase that and make that into something that isn't explicable from the old system.
And how about communication? You said earlier that you feel like story is not a form of communication. That's a big misapprehension many people have. But it does seem that becoming better story thinkers should make us better storytellers. So what advice do you give? What is sort of the primally intelligent secret to storytelling?
If I had to give people one most profound piece of advice about communicating, it's that the most effective stories are honest. And even more profoundly, being honest with yourself about your own story. One of the things that I've discovered, and I work now with a lot of leaders, is that I ask leaders to do this very simple exercise. I say, what I want you to do is I want you to go into a room and I want you to start from your earliest memory and just think from your entire life story all the way to the present. And they will start this exercise, and then at some point they will get up in the middle of it and be like, I can't do this. And I'll say, why not? And the reason they can't do it is because there's something in their life story that they don't want to admit or don't want to talk about or don't want to think about. And we want to go back to those parts of the story and acknowledge them and then integrate them and discover the meaning for them. You know, being honest with yourself about who you are and not having these strong shame responses, for example, to a lot of parts of your own biography. And so my number one tip for communication is when you go to talk to somebody, sit down, say to yourself, you know, what's something that I would feel uncomfortable about telling this person about myself that is nevertheless honest? Make a commitment to revealing that. If it comes up naturally in conversation, you don't have to force it. But if you commit to saying to that person things that are hard for you, what happens is you don't display evasiveness in the conversation. You display openness. And then immediately that other person says, this is someone who can be trusted because they're not evading what I'm saying. And then that person will start to open up more and start to tell you things. And then the two of you will get much faster to the root of who both of you are and what both of you want. And that's really what communication is communication is an analog for communion, essentially. It's about getting two minds together. It's not about marketing or manipulating or controlling. Those are things that computers do, right? As a computer, you're always trying to program the next computer. As a human, you're trying to learn from the people around you. That's what you're trying to do. You're not trying to program. So that's my best tip is honesty.
For a limited time at McDonald's, get a Big Mac extra value meal for $8. That means 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun, and medium fries, and a drink. We may need to change that jingle.
Prices and participation may vary.
At Starbucks, we've more than doubled parental leave for full and part-time baristas, giving them up to 18 weeks of paid time off, so they can be there for early bedtimes, late nights, first laughs, and spend more time with the best company they know. At Starbucks, benefits like parental leave are just the start. Learn more about Starbucks industry-leading benefits at starbucks.com/partners.
One way to read this book is just as a rebuke of artificial intelligence and as a rebuke to all the people who are out there saying our days are numbered as human beings, artificial general and then super intelligence is just around the corner. AI can do everything a human can, only better. Am I right in assuming that you are not someone who sees artificial intelligence as an existential threat?
Oh, it's definitely not an existential threat. No, it's a marketing gimmick. Is it possible in the future that we could build machines that think like the human brain? It is possible. But to do that, we'd have to have many, many, many massive major hardware breakthroughs. We'd have to build machines that are different from computers fundamentally. And that is so far into the future that that's not something that we need to worry about now. And to be honest, if those machines were built, they would probably think like humans. And so I don't think they would be that much of a danger to us. They would probably have the same limitations that we ourselves have. And so the main point of the book really is don't freak out about computers, but do freak out about the state of your own intelligence and do freak out about the state of the intelligence of young people in this country because they're being put through a system that's trained them to think like computers. And so it's making them unnecessarily anxious, angry, brittle. And what I talk about in the book is how you as a parent, you as an adult can pick up some of these techniques, learn them for yourself, and then start to mentor them for young people so that young people can go into the world more equipped to act with the initiative, the imagination, the common sense, all these things are going to serve them in the future and that are ultimately going to help all of us when we're old. They can take over and they can create the better future that all of us want to live in.
And do you use AI at all? And I ask you that not as like a gotcha question, like, oh, the AI hater loves ChatGPT, but more like, regardless of how smart or dumb this technology is, it's clearly not going anywhere. So how do you think about, how are you using it in your own life, and how do you think about how we can sort of collaborate effectively with AI while bringing what we're good at to the table and outsourcing what we're not good at to AI?
Well, I don't use AI to write or to brainstorm. And in fact, I really don't use AI at all. I have been involved for almost 10 years now in natural language processing uses of AI. So I work a lot on these systems and sort of helping develop them. But, my sense is that these LLMs are not very useful. And they're not very useful as research tools, and they're not very useful as writing tools. They can be focused in certain ways to be helpful in a kind of moderate sense, but I don't think that they're going to be very useful. I think in the long term, we're going to see software engineers who develop special localized applications for machine learning and other various forms of symbolic systems, expert systems, things like that, sort of standard AI stuff. That's always going to be with us. That's always going to be great, but that's always going to be driven by the imagination of these software engineers. So I'm pretty bearish on the future of AI. I mean, I think that it's a neat gadget, and I'm particularly bearish on LLMs. I don't see those as doing much more than disrupting bad teaching, which for sure they are doing. I mean, they're destroying bad teaching. They're destroying standardized tests. But I think once we get through that and teachers start to be given more autonomy to develop good, effective teaching that empowers students, that allows them to use their imagination and their initiative, I think that's going to be a kind of a healthy revolution. And I think you're going to see AI use start to diminish. I think it's already diminishing, to be honest. I think my predictions of a bubble are starting to be borne out.
Well, you certainly know a little bit about destroying standardized tests, but I will leave that story for readers to discover in the book. I just want to close by asking you, do you mind if I ask you a personal question?
No, of course. Ask me anything.
You write really movingly at the end of the book about your dad and some of the challenges he faced in life. I wonder if you could share just a little bit of that story with listeners.
Yeah, so a lot of my own life actually has been lived with the knowledge that I'm very similar to my dad. And my dad is a very kind man. He has, I think, something of a beautiful mind, but he was also has been something of a disaster at life. He essentially ended up with a substance problem. And that substance problem gave us a very kind of unstable economic life growing up. And so, we just spent a lot of the time feeling very scared. And as part of that story, one of the things that ended up happening was my younger sister passed away. And this for my dad trained as a doctor, was just sort of very mentally debilitating for him. He blamed himself. And it was kind of at that point that our entire family structure sort of fell apart. And I ended up spending a lot of time being the adult in the house and sort of helping to raise my younger sisters. And what I think that experience did for me, challenging as it was, is it did give me an incredible sense of self, because I had to grow up and I had to use my initiative and my imagination to kind of be the adult when I was 12, 13, 14 years old. But as readers will discover when they open the book is dedicated to my father. And one of the reasons the book is dedicated to my father is when I was a young child, what my father would do is he would read to me. And he read me beautiful stories, and he read me poetry. He read me William Blake. And I often think of my dad as a kind of a William Blake person. There's a famous poem, Tiger, Tiger.
Burning bright in the forests of the night. Yeah.
And, William Blake was a romantic. He was a Shakespearean. He was someone who believed in the power of imagination. And he believed specifically in primal intelligence. He talks a lot about primal brain and whatnot. And so what I like to think is that was sort of my dad's gift to me, and that I was sort of fortunate to be able to kind of finish off the story that he had begun.
How do you think, if at all, some of the things you've learned in writing Primal Intelligence and in doing this research and working with the Army might have helped your dad, think differently about his own story?
Well, one of the things I know for sure is it's made me a better dad, and it's improved my relationship with my father. And so, sort of quick story, when my daughter was born, I stopped sleeping because I was afraid that she was going to pass away like my sister did. And through kind of the process of working with Army Special Operations and whatnot, I developed a lot more confidence. I developed a lot more common sense. I developed the ability to realize that my daughter could actually take care of herself because she's super tough and super smart and super strong. And I started sleeping through the night. And I've also been able to have very honest conversations with my dad. When I was younger, I didn't want to have hard conversations with him because I felt like it might upset him, and I also had a lot of anger in me towards him. And I've since gotten rid of all that anger and learned to kind of sit down. And my relationship with my dad is definitely one of the best things in my life. And I've really come to realize how hard life was for him and how challenging it was for him and how he really did do his best every step of the way. And I have a lot of gratitude for the things that he's done for me. So for me, definitely the process of writing the book has been one of becoming just a little bit of a better human being, thanks in part to my dad.
Let's leave it there. The book is Primal Intelligence. Angus, it's been such a treat. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's been a huge pleasure, Caleb. Thank you.
And that's our show. Our sound designer is Mike Toda, and our executive producer is Rufus Griscom. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know by leaving us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Or, if you're shy, send me an email. You can reach me at podcast@nextbigideaclub.com. I'm Caleb Bissinger. See you next week.